Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. Thanks for your patience. We will be starting just momentarily after we get everyone here in the meeting. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. All right, great to see all these smiling faces this evening. Great to see many of you that I see every week now. I feel like I'm getting to know you all. It's wonderful. All right, looks like we've got a good crowd in here tonight, so thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tara Johnson-Noem. I'm one of the Board of Trustees members for Behringer-Crawford Museum, and thank you so much for joining us for episode 24, I think is correct, for Northern Kentucky History Hour. We have a great program. I had a preview the other day. We have a great program for you tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we let our guests get started. If you are new and you haven't joined us before, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. This is, while we have everyone, muted, this is really intended to be an interactive event or meeting. And so we have a chat bar at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. A little, bubble, like word bubble there. You can please type in questions or comments that you have. I'll be monitoring that chat. And then at the end of the presentation, I will ask your questions. So don't be shy. And we also have the ability to, we are streaming this on Facebook. And so I did want to let you all know if you missed anything or if one of your friends missed it, you can direct them to Behringer-Crawford's Facebook page and they can check out this and actually all of the past episodes that we have had on topics ranging from archaeology to local government history. So very, just a ton of information. The other thing that the Facebook page and Behringer-Crawford's YouTube channel have are the curators chats. Curator of Collections, Jason French, has so many interesting sessions that he has recorded about artifacts from the museum and also just interesting locations throughout our region. And so they're a little shorter, maybe like 5 to 10 minutes. So it's a perfect thing to just break up your day and learn a little bit more about Northern Kentucky. This could not possibly happen without our incredible supporters for the museum. So I do want to thank the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, the Kentucky Arts Council, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, as well as the Carol Ann and Ralphie Hale U.S. Bank Foundation. So thank you to all of them. And thank you to our members. We happen to know that many of you have joined as a result of taking part in this program. We want to say thank you so much for your support in these trying times of quarantine. We were really happy to be able to create this virtual programming for you, and we really, really appreciate how you've come out and supported us in that. So if you're not a member yet, you can find out more at bcmuseum.org. So let's see here. Just need to pull up one more thing from my email. So sorry for 1 second. I will also let you all know that we have some really interesting programming coming up for the holiday season. We know that, it's going to be a little bit of a different holidays this year. So be watching the website for the museum for more information about what we have in store. The staff have put together some pretty great programming considering everything that's going on. Okay, without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome our guest tonight. His name is Marty Schadler. He's a resident of Northern Kentucky. He's a board member of the Aviation Museum of Kentucky in Lexington. He is a lifetime member of the Commemorative Air Force, an international organization dedicated to the preservation and operation of historic military aircraft. And he has a really interesting presentation for us tonight, a little bit of it in honor of Veterans Day. We have him here talking about Flying High, Women in the Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame. Marty, welcome.
Oh, and hello, Tara. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for all your support.
Absolutely. I am going to pull up your presentation now. And I'm just going to close that. Sorry. And all right.
All right, there we are. And so everyone, welcome. And again, thanks for inviting me. The museum has been open since 1995, so this is our 25th year. We're proud of that. And we can go ahead to the next slide. That's who I am, of course, member of the Board of Trustees. I've been involved since 2004. I am one of 2 Northern Kentucky board members. We go to the next one. And here we are. We're located at Airport Road at Bluegrass Airport in Lexington. We've been in that particular building since 2011, and it all started back in 1978 with a group called the Kentucky Aviation Roundtable, just an informal gathering of people who wanted to talk airplanes. Some were pilots, and with great effort and resources, we were able to become the organization we are today. We are 501(c), don't get any support from the state, but we are now in our 25th year. We are home to the Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame, which will be a big source for my material tonight. And also we conduct aviation summer camp when things are normal. COVID basically whacked both of those things out this year, but we're looking forward to better things. So next slide. My topic tonight, Flying High, Women in the Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame. Background on the Hall of Fame, that was begun in 1996. We had a woman in our very first class. And since that time, we've had about 4 honorees each year. We are now up to 13 women in the Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame. And I'll be describing some very capable women and some very impressive achievements this evening. So next slide. I start with this quote. This is from an acquaintance of mine, a kind of a crusty old aircraft mechanic who once told me, Marty, these flying machines don't care if there's a man or a woman at the controls or in the cockpit. All they want is respect. And so I use that theme because the people I'll be talking about tonight definitely deserve our respect for their achievements. So next slide. To describe the 3 groups tonight, I'll be just talking about a group of women who I describe as pioneers, a group of women who I identify as flight instructors, and a third group called air racers. So it's a way to organize them and to recognize their achievements. So Tara, next slide, we can begin with the first pioneer. And this is Suzanne Guy Alexander. Suzanne is from, excuse me, Allen County. That's down at the border between Kentucky and Tennessee, right about in the middle of the state. If you recognize the city Scottsville, that is where she is from. And I'll just describe some points that are there on the image. She began as an ATC, that's an air traffic controller. Suzanne had studied music at Western Kentucky, really couldn't make a living at it. And her husband, after college, basically says, would you consider something in aviation? Well, she had great timing. It was 1981. And if you remember a little history, President Reagan and a group called PATCO, that was the union for the traffic controllers, disagreed, and he fired them all. So it was a real opening for Suzanne. But from that, she moved up the ladder of getting to better jobs. Promotions is what I'm looking for. And she got to being responsible for equipment improvement at some of our busiest airports. And that is a lot more than just bringing in equipment and plugging it in. It involves construction and environmental impact and getting permits and so on. But she got through that, really improved the situation out in the Seattle airport. And that moved her up to the next job, where she became the manager of the air traffic controllers for the busiest airspace in the world. This is called our Eastern region. And so the airports in New York, New Jersey, Washington, DC, including Atlanta, Charlotte, all that very busy Eastern Seaboard area. Suzanne was the manager of all the air traffic controllers there. A big job when you think of, in normal times, how many thousands of airplanes and thousands of people are in that airspace. So Suzanne was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2013. And as the statement says, they're the first woman to hold that position with the FAA. Let's move to the next one now. This is a tower that at Cincinnati, and I use that just as an example. The people who work up there as traffic controllers were all the people under the supervision of Suzanne Alexander. And, you know, as a music major, if you're capable with music, you have particular talents. You're probably have composure, you can have anticipation, you have a way to focus your energies. Basically, that said to me that Suzanne had the talents to get into that job of air traffic control, and obviously by her promotions became a real achiever for our Federal Aviation Administration. Okay, next slide. Oh, very interesting. Another achiever here from Kentucky, Willa Brown Chappell, grew up in Glasgow down in Barron County. That's kind of south and west middle part of the state. And she is a real achiever and an icon for African-American women. First point there, first Black woman in the USA, we have to put that detail in, to earn a pilot's license. She did that in the early 30s. And from that, she moved to Chicago and through marriage started a flight school. This was right before World War II, and there was a passage of a law called the Civilian Pilot Training Act, and it was addressed not only to white pilots, but also developing African-American flying talent. So the Coffee School of Aeronautics, that's what it was called after her husband's last name, brought Willa Brown Chappell into training the Black young men who would become the Tuskegee Airmen. So she was a contributor to a very well-recognized and honored unit during World War II that was, under those times, an all-segregated, all-Black African-American flight operation. Another point there, first Black woman officer in the Civil Air Patrol. Civil Air Patrol was really a key group during the World War II. A number of pilots with their own aircraft were patrolling our shores, looking out for enemy submarines and so on. And kind of a paramilitary group, but very well organized, still exists today, encourages our young people today to consider aviation and aeronautical careers. Willa Brown was there to get that all started as the first Black woman in the Civil Air Patrol. Willa is quite a person. In 1946, she ran for Congress, and from my records and research, the first Black woman to attempt that in our United States. So Willa passed away, unfortunately, in 1992, and she entered our Hall of Fame in 2003. So let's go to our next one. I'm from the Aviation Museum, so I have to show you airplanes. This would have been the type of aircraft Willa Brown Chappell would have been teaching those young African-American men who would become Tuskegee Airmen. So this is a basic biplane, primary trainer. You can see it's an open cockpit. The instructor pilot would be in the back, the training pilot would be in the front. And not only did this plane be used by Willa Brown Chappell, but so many of our pilots during World War II would have earned their time in primary flight training flying this plane. It was made by a company called Stearman. Some of them are preserved today. They're quite capable aircraft, kind of built like a truck because they were training aircraft, but one of the tools that Willa Brown used to train those guys who became the Tuskegee Airmen. Okay, we'll move to some more now. Here's some more pioneers, and these are true veterans from World War II. Mary Edith Engel from Lexington, Fayette County, and then Esther Ammerman, a little bit closer to us. She is from Cynthiana in Harrison County. Both of them were members of the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And this was really a group that stepped up for a need that we had early in the war years when aircraft had to be moved around and the men were basically training to go overseas. So one thing that Mary Edith and Esther did was come to be capable of flying all these military aircraft. And their jobs were to sometimes test them after repair, fly them from the factories to the East Coast or West Coast. They might have jobs of actually flying them down to Louisville. Louisville was a completion center, meaning that they would finish out the aircraft with the weapons or the things that were ordered. Some planes that got to Louisville ended up in the Royal Air Force. But if the planes were built, for example, in Detroit or something, wouldn't be surprising that you would have the WASP pilots flying. The unfortunate thing about the WASP is that as the war progressed and more men were trained, we got into 1943, 44, and the Army Air Force said, "Thank you very much, ladies. We're done with you. You can go home now," and didn't give them any veteran status. And while they were actually flying, if there were any accidents, and unfortunately around 30 some of the WASPs did die during their service, they had no resources to get them home for burial. Very often the other WASPs had to take a collection to help their sister who was now lost to get home for burial. That was a battle, and after the war, Esther Ammerman gets some credit for working with other WASPs. And so by the 70s, finally our government said these women deserve full veteran benefits, and they did earn those benefits. And then in 2009, the organization was recognized with the Congressional Gold Medal. The latest news is that there's a very good museum being developed in Texas where the WASPs did their initial training. So Mary Edith Engel and Esther Ammerman certainly deserve our recognition and did a great job for us during the Second World War. Next slide. I like to show this aircraft because those women learned to fly this big airplane. This is the B-29, the most sophisticated and largest aircraft that the United States built during World War II. It was the aircraft that carried the atomic weapons that ended the war, but it was a tough thing to fly. It was a little bit ahead of its time. It had a tendency for its engines to overheat. So you had to have basically a soft touch and knowing how to get those engines up to speed, and once it cruised, paying attention to engine temperatures. Some of the guys balked, said it was a plane no one could ever fly. The WASPs were brought in and showed these guys that it could be flown. So this is just one of the several aircraft that the WASPs learned to fly and did well during the Second World War. And we go to the next slide. Another pioneer and a very recent inductee, Terry Donner, was just inducted into the Hall of Fame this calendar year. UPS means United Parcel Service Senior Captain. And as a pioneer, she was the first mother and son crew to fly in an FAA regulation regarding transport aircraft, FAA Part 121. So that is Terry with her son, and it looks like they're doing some checking of navigation charts or maps. But she was the first mother-son crew leader in this flight. Just happened recently, a few years back. And Terry has also endeavored to be an advocate for women in professional aviation. She's very active in Women in Aviation International. There's the Bluegrass chapter based in Louisville, and she and her sister UPS pilots really make that organization go. So we recognize Terry for that achievement. She is also an instructor pilot, and like most everyone else, started off as a flight engineer and worked her way up to becoming a senior captain. We can go to the next slide. This is Terry's office. This is an A300 Airbus. That is the plane that she is assigned to and would be flying out of Louisville. So she would be over there in the left seat. And next slide. This is the A300. It's a full airliner type aircraft just set up for cargo operations. I know that Terry had usual assignments from Louisville, very often to Chicago and other large, Minneapolis, perhaps other large airports north, and moving cargo, UPS items from their world port, that's what they call it in Louisville, to places basically north of Kentucky. So that's another pioneer. We'll move to the next one now, next slide. And this person is a real rocket scientist, Dr. Shelba Prophet. She is from Whitesburg in Letcher County over on the east side of the state. And the points there bring out what she was able to do after getting physics and chemistry degrees from Center College. She is a rocket scientist on both space and tactical missile systems. On the space side, in some of her first work, she was at the Missile Center there in Alabama, working with Wernher von Braun, the ex-Patriot who we were able to attract after World War II. And we probably would not have put men on the moon without his expertise in building very large rockets. Dr. Shelba worked with him. And then tactical missile systems, those are basically systems designed to stop other planes or other missiles making an attack. And so she was involved with something called the Patriot missile system. You can see the next point there. And that alphabet soup, PGMXO, it means she was the program executive officer. For those good services, she ends up on the Civilian Wall of Honor. A little detail on that. For those folks who are not active military, and are involved with major programs for defense systems or aeronautical systems, there is a recognition, and Dr. Prophet earned that Civilian Wall of Honor recognition. So a very capable person and a real rocket scientist. And next slide, I'll show you what she made. This is a Patriot missile system at launch. You can imagine what that sounds like, but those rectangular shapes basically hold multiple missiles, and the whole system is on a carriage, a truck. And what's impressive about this is that this thing goes up, finds another missile going about 3 times the speed of sound, so around 2,000 miles an hour, hunts it down and blows it up in the sky. So it's a tactical air defense system, very sophisticated in the days that it was first introduced. It's received some upgrades, and we have also helped some of our allies with it. Israel bought the Patriot missile system, added their sophisticated touches to it. They call their system now the Iron Dome. But to think that you can devise a weapon system that will go up and catch something going about 3 times the speed of sound and knock it out of the sky, quite an impressive feat of engineering, and we can certainly credit Dr. Prophet for being part of that. Let's go to the next one, and this will be someone you're going to recognize. Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath of the Marine Corps, who recently was in state politics and had an unsuccessful bid for US Senate. But her military service is the reason why she's in the Aviation Hall of Fame. First of all, she got into the Naval Academy on something called the Superintendent's Appointment. That means that they found out that she was interested and she didn't have to compete. She was invited to come to the Naval Academy. In her younger years, she actually did a mail campaign to the members of the House and Senate asking why women were not allowed to fly combat missions. She got several not so kind responses, including one from the Kentucky senator at the time. But by the time she gets out of the Marines, women were allowed to fly combat missions, and that put her into the back seat of a FA-18 combat plane as a Marine flag officer. She was a weapons system officer and became the first woman to fly in that combat mode. So she made that achievement. After her flying days, she went back and was a professor at the Naval Academy for a few years, and now lives in Georgetown in Scott County, and as you know, has entered politics and perhaps someday be successful. Let's go to the next slide. We'll look at what Amy flew. This is the FA-18. This is a single-seater version, and that shot is just when an FA-18 would be leaving an aircraft carrier. If you're not familiar with carrier operations, basically these planes are thrown into the sky by a catapult mechanism. They go from 0 to about 160 in 3 seconds. So you can imagine the acceleration and the G-forces that pilots feel. And then coming down, they have to catch a arrestor cable that's across the deck. They have a hook that snags that. And if they make that approach, they also have to come in at full power in case they miss it. So you get jerked and twisted around and bounced around inside these jets and takeoff and landing. Colonel McGrath was asked about the first time she did what is called her first trap, the first time she made a landing with an arrestor cable on a carrier. And it was kind of humorous. She said, well, it was sort of a brutal combination of feeling childbirth and a huge bowel movement at the same time. So kind of gross, but also a recognition that you got to be a tough person to fly these things. I should also recognize that as a Marine pilot, Lieutenant Colonel McGrath did what are called ground support missions. Now, that means that you would be coming in perhaps low and slow. You have to be very accurate where you drop your weapons because you're helping out the Marines on the ground. So you're doing what is close air support missions. It's relatively different from what Air Force pilots do, but Marines and naval aviators are taught to do close air support. That was something that Amy did during her flight career. So we wish her the best as she pursues her politics. And let's move on to our next pioneer. And here we have another scientist who was recognized for really developing something that will have great promise in the future. Dr. Suzanne Weaver-Smith directs the UK NASA program. NASA regularly supports engineering programs and space science programs at universities around our country. And at UK, Dr. Smith runs ours in leading students in space research. And so NASA really does well at this. It doesn't cost them much for the benefits and the development time that the students and the professors come up with. And one of the things they have come up with under Dr. Smith's guidance is this inflatable wing plane for Mars. And I'll be talking about it a little more in a moment. But Dr. Smith's background, she did work on the International Space System. She is a mechanical engineer by profession and is a vibrations expert. So when you get those things up there, it takes a little effort. They get rattled around launching from Earth, and then they got to hook together. And so she was making sure that things didn't fall apart when the International Space System was being developed. So she earns our status as a pioneer, as a woman in the Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame. And next slide. This is a group of students that she was working with to make the space plane that will fly on Mars. It's right in front of them, but we'll go to the next slide. And that's what this thing looks like. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, they're going to Mars. There's no air up there. Well, there is no air as we know it on Earth, but there are some gases in the atmosphere, and it is enough gas that lift can be generated and a very light aircraft could fly, sort of like a radio-controlled drone as we would fly them here on Earth. So this is the current stage of development, but you know, Mars is on the agenda for NASA to visit. It may not be real close, but this kind of thing would be ready to be flown by maybe someone on Mars, or it might be flown remotely from Earth by radio control. So Dr. Smith and her students have made a real contribution, and to be able to fly this around Mars and maybe with a small camera, we could really learn a whole lot about the red planet. So that's one thing that, again, we have recognized Dr. Smith by her induction into the Hall of Fame. Next slide. Okay, one more pioneer, and here we have another professor, but another school from Eastern Kentucky University. Dr. Wilma Walker has been recognized for the incredible patience, more than anything else, to develop a program of an aviation major at EKU. She is a geography professor by her education, but was asked to start the opportunity to make a program that would end up being an aviation major at Eastern. So it finally, through all her development and good efforts, the first class was offered in 1983, and by 1991, it was a full major. It's a very impressive program. There's over 300, at our most recent check, over 300 undergrads in the program. And under normal times, of course, COVID's kind of changed things like it's changed everything else. That number may have gone down a little bit, but it is still the first and only four-year degree program of aviation in the Commonwealth. We've had some of the students join us as volunteers at the museum, and really a good group of people. And if you have the resources, you can enter there as a freshman and walk out with your pilot's license and a really great knowledge that would get you into a job very quickly these days. And all thanks to Dr. Walker and her persistence in making that program come about. Next slide. This is one of the grapes of success, you might say. This is one of the planes that is in the Eastern Kentucky program. The student pilots there who are in the aviation major fly this type of plane. In aircraft language, it is a high wing monoplane, all metal monoplane. And the kind of thing that if you were going over to Lunken Airport and interested in getting your pilot's license, you'd probably start in the same type of aircraft. Next slide. Here's another fruit of Dr. Walker's good work. This is the airport that the Eastern Kentucky uses. It's down between Richmond and Berea. It's called the Central Kentucky Regional Airport. The hangars and so on that we see there right there are all basically part of the EKU program. And the program is growing. I know this photo is already outdated. There's been some additions and some buildings added. And it is a program that we as Kentuckians can take pride in. We are very fortunate as a small state to have a lot of aviation and aerospace business. A big addition has been at CVG, of course, with all the cargo aircraft. I've already mentioned Terry Donner with UPS. That's a big factor. And we have a number of manufacturers as well. Part of that begins with something like a college program at EKU, and thanks to Dr. Walker. Next slide. Okay, we've gone from the pioneers, that group of women, to the instructors. And I have a very special woman here who has done something that will probably never, ever happen again. And that was through her career of being an instructor pilot. And you can see from the slide some of the information that is, to me, really impressive. Over 10,000 student pilots. And then in being up in the air with these student pilots, she amassed over 6.5 years in the air. I think that's like 37,000 or 38,000 hours of being at the controls of an aircraft. She earned the nickname Mama Bird for all this work. And prior to her passing in 2012, she was a feature story on CBS News Sunday morning for having done this. There was a story about her flying on a commercial flight, and the pilot recognized her and said over the intercom, we have Mama Bird Johnson on board today, and she's flown more than anybody on this airplane who's assigned to fly it. So really a well-recognized person for her skills. She was also honored by induction into the National Aviation Hall of Fame a few years after we honored her. She wasn't not only a very busy flying students around, she also ran a small airport in Tennessee. And Evelyn is from, check this out, I'd like to share that with you. She is from Barberville in Knox County. So again, kind of the Eastern Appalachian side of the state, but she's done something that will probably never, ever be done again by any male or female pilot. Next slide. This would have been the type of plane that Mama Bird would have taken you up in. Again, it's an all metal high wing monoplane, but that's where you start when you take your pilot's lessons. Next slide. Here's the other instructor. And first of all, I want you to notice the photo of Sherry Coyne Marshall. She unfortunately lost her right arm as a child in, of all things, a washing machine accident. She was about 3 or 4 years old, but that did not stop her. She basically went through life knowing this is what I've got and I'm going to succeed. And through waivers from the FAA, she became a commercial pilot. She became a flight examiner and ran an airline over in the west side of the state. And all of this, despite that disability. She is a person of incredible spirit. She even wrote a book about her misfortune. It's called One Can Do It. And as a woman, she actually shows by photos in her book the technique that she used to change a cloth diaper on her children. And if you got little ones, even disposable diapers aren't a thrill to deal with. But Sherry just had that willpower to do it. So just from her strength alone, we certainly should honor her. Sherry is from McCracken County. That's way over on the west side of the state. Paducah is a major city in McCracken County. So that is an achievement, obviously, to be recognized. Next slide, please. And Sherry would have been an FAA examiner in these types of aircraft. This is a smaller type of regional propeller-driven aircraft that smaller regional carriers that might visit smaller cities as compared to CVG or Louisville would be flying and providing services of passenger service and cargo service. To get qualifying that, you may have taken a ride with Sherry Coyne Marshall to be a pilot for that. Next slide. Okay, now an air racers, and we've moved from the pioneers through the instructors to the air racers. And Koko Kokanover is an interesting person for what happened and how she ever got into flying. She is an air racer, and when I'm talking about air racing, this is point-to-point air racing. In her type of racing, Koko would fly from one airport to another, and then by the type of aircraft she was flying, there would be an estimate on the time to fly, her fuel usage, and how close she would in her flight match these standards. And so she got involved in the 50s. She did it so well on one of her first races, she earned special recognition. Getting into flying was a very personal matter for her. She had a kind of rambunctious son who wanted to go out and fly on Sundays when flights were offered to the public down in Lexington, but he didn't like to go to church. So Koki did a deal saying, if you go to church and Sunday school, we'll go out to the airport. Well, Koki goes out there and finds out that she probably likes flying more than her son, and so earns her pilot's license, does some flying, and then actually kind of makes it her profession by becoming a flying ambassador for the Kentucky Farm Bureau. And this was in the late 40s and early 50s, flying around Kentucky. And I can tell you that our airport resources in those days weren't all the greatest. So Koki was pretty brave pilot to be touching down on obviously grass strips and other airports that weren't all that well developed, in her encouraging women to get involved with the Kentucky Farm Bureau. Koki is a nickname. Her actual given name is Greenwood. I think that might be a Southern cultural thing where you take a name from a surname from a family or something, but I think I'd want to be called Koki rather than Greenwood as well. Koki, there's also unfortunately a sad story to her ending. Koki slipped on her front stairs that were covered with ice in about the mid 50s, and unfortunately struck her head, suffered a skull fracture. And so for all her brave flying, she has a unfortunately very sad demise that was due to the weather. But we still recognize her for her achievements, and she certainly deserves those. Next slide. Another air racer, just a bit more closer to our time, Betty Mosley. Betty was encouraged to fly by her husband. She and her husband settled in Lexington after World War II. He had been a World War II pilot. He had a very successful dental practice and encouraged her to start flying. And so she solos in 1968, and she enters her first race by 1971. And in those 3 years, she got a lot of flying in, because you do have to have certain minimal qualifications to participate in these cross-country races. While she was in a race, another pilot got on the air and saying, "I'm lost, I'm running out of fuel, this isn't good for me." And Betty basically forfeited her right to win by saying, I'll help you out, follow me in, those kinds of things. And did a very gracious thing in helping another competitor not lose airplane or life in the effort of competing to win that race. That was kind of the spirit of Betty. She later became a FAA accident prevention counselor. She did encourage women to get involved. And back in the early 70s, she organized something called Kentucky Aviation Week. And a sidebar to what she accomplished there, she had a very good relationship with the commander of that, at that time, the Kentucky Air National Guard. And the National Guards get different types of aircraft during their years of operation. At that time, in the early 70s, our Kentucky Air National Guard was flying something called an F-101. It was a recon plane. It had cameras in its nose. It was supersonic. And Betty, we called her Miss Betty, basically exerted some what we call profound moral influence, I guess, and got to fly that plane with the commander of the Air Guard back in 1972 during Aviation Week. Betty was definitely her own person. She had her plane nicknamed the Smitten Kitten, and she went to Piper Aircraft and picked it up on her own and flew it back when she got it. So it was a whole brand new plane to her. And we had that in the museum for a while. Upon her passing in 2017, the estate recovered it and thought they were going to keep it in the family. There were some other flyers in her family. The plane made it back to Texas, but where I believe the family member now still flies it. But I mentioned Texas because one time while she was still with us, my wife and I were at an event with Miss Betty at the museum, and Betty was talking to Ruth, my spouse, and was mentioning that one time there was a major social event in Lexington, and Miss Betty could not find the perfect dress. So she just got frustrated, went out to the Bluegrass Airport, got her plane out, pre-flighted it, flew all the way to Dallas and Neiman Marcus to go shopping for the perfect dress. And apparently she found it. So it was quite an achievement. But Betty was a big Kentucky loyalist as well. She wasn't born in our state, but story goes that her hangar was one of the best decorated UK kind of dens to watch the sporting events for UK. And it was not uncommon if you were in her social circle, to be invited out to the airport and watch the game in Betty's hangar. So we are very glad to have recognized Betty Mosley and her support of flying and UK. Next slide. And this would have been the type of aircraft, the Piper aircraft, that Betty Mosley went to Piper Aircraft Corporation to pick up. Hers was red and white rather than this blue one, but this is a really good shot of the type of aircraft that she flew. So that's why I have included it. So this would be an all metal low monoplane type design if you want to talk airplane language. Next slide. Okay, and now I close with that statement I had previously. All these women deserve our respect. You know, aviation has been a male-dominated profession and industry for a number of years, and it's been changing. And the Aviation Museum of Kentucky and the Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame has been honored really to find those folks, those women in Kentucky who have stood out in this industry dominated by males, and have been able to honor them. So it is really my pleasure to talk about them and to share these stories. And I hope you enjoyed what I think is unfortunately unknown story, but a very good story for us who are loyal to Kentucky. So thank you very much for tuning in.
Marty, that was great. Thank you so much. I just absolutely love hearing these, and yeah, they're coming in lots of, you should definitely read the chat because there's a lot of comments there that are directed just specifically to you, Marty. I have you know, an interest. My dad, who was watching, was a private pilot, and so I mean, a lot of he had a Piper Cherokee for a while, so you know, it's been really neat to, I'm glad you included the pictures of the airplanes, because I think that really kind of gives us a real perspective of what some of these women were able to do. I was wondering, we have a couple minutes, the story that you told about the women who were flying that particular, I believe it was in World War II, that like very sort of difficult to fly airplane. Can we go back to that story for just a minute or two, and I'm gonna, I don't actually know if I can go, whoops, hold on a second, let me see if I can go back to that picture.
Sure.
Let me see here. Sorry everybody, I'm just gonna go, I'm not used to having to navigate it all by myself. Let's see here.
There you are.
So here's this.
Yes.
So I just, you know, I just thought that this story of these women and kind of what they were able to do was just really fascinating. And I was just wondering, do you have any idea how many women, you know, from Kentucky might have ended up really serving in the Women's Air Force service?
I don't have a specific number, Tara. I know there was a woman from Northern Kentucky. I don't think she's with us anymore, but she was involved. The one thing that influenced the women who entered the WASPs is that many of them had already had, either through family connections or spousal connections, some experience with flying. Esther Ammerman, for example, had been a parachute rigger. And she was at one time the only licensed parachute rigger and packer in Nebraska when she was on duty up there. Wow. And that's where she met her husband, Ammerman, who was in pilot training. Mary Engel was involved with horse racing, and basically from family connections and so on, had a private flying experience before they got into the WASPs. Now, I think if I get my numbers correct here, Tara, about 1,100 women qualified as pilots in the WASP program, but a number of them were also involved with maintenance and all the things that make airplanes fly. And they were put in some pretty dangerous situations. For example, one I can think of is target towing. They would be up in a plane pulling a big sleeve, basically, maybe brightly colored red or orange. And the men who were training as fighter pilots would basically be trying to shoot at that. And if they were first timers and not very accurate, it was not uncommon for the women pulling the plane in the tow plane to take some fire and come back with some bullet holes in their plane. So
Oh my
That was
goodness.
kind of dangerous.
Yeah.
And like all pilots, they had to deal with weather. And back in those days, we didn't have the weather predictions and monitoring capabilities. So a number of them, I believe it was in the number of 30s or so, were actually lost. Women who were WASP pilots were lost in their service.
Mhm.
I just saw someone bring up something about flying in Vietnam. Yes, we did not have any combat pilots in World War II or in Vietnam. It was basically into the 70s that they were allowed to train. And so by the time we got to Desert Storm and our future conflicts, we have had women combat pilots. An interesting point, thinking of what was going on in the 40s, the Russian Air Force did have women combat pilots.
Oh,
And
wow.
they flew some rather rickety aircraft. And to share a little story, one of their missions was to fly at night. That's risky in itself, and to do what are called interdiction missions. Basically, aggravate the enemy below with bombs or blowing up bridges and so on. And the women were so good, the Germans nicknamed them the Night Witches. Not very flattering, but very capable pilots. And so they certainly deserve our recognition as well. But I hope I answered your question about the WASP. They definitely deserve much more recognition. And fortunately, that gold medal from Congress in 2009 was a step, and the veterans benefits. And unfortunately, like that generation, so many of them are gone and not many still survive.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple of other questions. Let's see. Nancy Wolpert was wondering if you know Wilma's instructor background and was she ever recognized nationally? I believe she was the one that had so many hours. Is that correct? Yes.
Yes, Evelyn Johnson. Yes, her recognition, first of all, in the profession, anyone who was an instructor recognized that her ability and her patience with all those pilots was a gift. And I happen to have had the good luck to see that special report that CBS Sunday Morning did about her. And she was up in her years at that time, but you could just see that she had a calm in the cockpit that if somebody went up there and just really goofed up, she wouldn't have got flustered. She would have just really been able to handle it. Now, I know one thing that was very beneficial to Evelyn Johnson is that in her career, she took the time to get what are called ratings for a number of aircraft. So she could fly single engine, multi-engine, tail draggers, the ones that have a gear that the back wheels do. She basically had what are called pilot ratings for everything but hot air balloons.
Wow.
So she was the flying person incarnate, I guess we want to call her, because she was just so engaged in that.
Yeah. And then I realized, Nancy, I apologize. I was very interested in that story. But I got Nancy's question incorrect. She was wondering about Wilma, is it Chappelle? And the
Willa
first,
Brown?
yes, Willa Brown Chappelle. And she was wondering about, her being an instructor to the Tuskegee Airmen. I think she was wondering about, had she ever been recognized nationally that you know?
There is another woman's pilot organization where Willa has been recognized. As I recall, it is the group took the time to recognize like the top 100 women in aviation history, and Willa Brown is definitely in that group. There is a group called the 99s, which goes back to Amelia Earhart, and that's basically, as I recall, an international association of women pilots, and they have noted Willa Brown Chappelle's achievements as well. But an important thing to point out there is that in that Civilian Pilot Training Act, which was basically a government money to help train pilots because the war was on the horizon, the Tuskegee Institute, the Hampton Institute, and Howard University were the institutes of, the formal institutes of education that received money. but then her Coffee School of Aeronautics, which was operating at a small airport outside of Chicago, had the status to be recognized, first of all, by our War Department, Department of Defense, and to earn that funding, and to have the vision to know that African American pilots were going to have to be needed for the war effort back in those segregated times. And so Willa, I think, had a vision about knowing that African Americans had to take their place in the history of what's going to unfold there in the war, and she was able to help it.
It's amazing. It's such an incredible story. We have a couple of other just comments about other individuals that have family connections. I'm not sure that I have time to go through all of them, but you might want to check out the chat. I know personally, my grandmother helped to build B-24, the Liberator, at the Willow Run facility, in Michigan. And I know a lot of women were involved in that kind of aspect with the war effort as well. So a lot of ways that women have been connected to aviation. And I am really intrigued. I would like to know, as we get close to our close, once COVID's over, are there, you mentioned having a plane in Lexington. So are there other planes that we could potentially come and visit at the Bluegrass Airport once things get a little back to normal?
Well, we certainly hope so. We did have to cancel a visit of a historic B-17 bomber from the World War II era. Those folks have said they would like to look a year later. So in the autumn of 2021, that's possible. We do not have any flying aircraft, but we have a fair representation of military plus general aviation. One thing I always like to share is that we have a full-scale replica of the very first aircraft designed, built, and flown in Kentucky, and that all happened in December 1908.
Wow.
Now, it's a replica from the actual original drawings. The individual who developed this was an attorney and had the wisdom of making very precise drawings and getting patents. And so we keep this in our hangar, obviously, but the aircraft was built by a gentleman whose name was Matthew Sellers. And as I said, he did it in 1908, 5 years after the Wright brothers, but he was very fastidious in recording things, and he replicated so many of the wind tunnel tests and other aeronautical learning that he had to do to make his airplane. And what was interesting, the Wright brothers, when they first flew theirs, they were lying on their belly. Sellers was setting up straight. So he had a design that had that advantage. But yeah, we do host planes as we can. And the Bluegrass Airport has been most generous in allowing us to do that and supporting us. But COVID has kind of goofed us up, to say the least. We usually had a lecture series, and just to give a little background about the museum, we were fortunate enough while he was still alive to have General Paul Tibbets, the gentleman who flew one of those big airplanes that the ladies did, the B-29. He was the pilot who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And we've had some other folks who have been involved in some military operations as well. We once had the president of the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association come and talk. And we really have to respect people who fly aircraft in combat. You're incredibly vulnerable, and you have to keep your cool, and you have to make your machine work right to do your job. And for those folks who've done those things, and we've got a lot of good Americans who've done it, certainly deserve our respect. And we try to recognize their contribution as well.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to trying to come down and visit when things get a little bit back to normal. I do want to say to all those who mentioned their family veterans in the chat, thank you for their service and sacrifice as well on this Veterans Day. We only have about 3 minutes left. So Marty, I want to say thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure to get to know you over the last couple of weeks as we've been preparing for this presentation. It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much. And to everyone else that's watching, I want to say thank you to your continued support of Northern Kentucky History Hour, and let you know next week we have a very interesting speaker who will be joining us, and he will be talking a little bit about a true story murder mystery on a Cincinnati steamboat on the Ohio River. So definitely join us next week for that. We will be taking a break to celebrate Thanksgiving with our family on the week of Thanksgiving, but we will be back December 2nd. Blanche Sullivan, who I'm pretty sure is with us tonight, is going to be talking about holiday traditions in greater Cincinnati and northern Kentucky. And we hope that you join us for both of those events. So stay tuned for more details about upcoming episodes. And until then, I did want to say I botched my opening. And so I wanted to apologize. And again, thank our financial supporters, the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, Arts Wave, the Kentucky Arts Council, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and the Carol Ann and Ralph B. Hale Jr. U.S. Bank Foundation. So I apologize to one that I missed the first time. And thank you to our members. Thanks to the museum staff and all of the trustees who have joined us tonight. And good night, everybody. Thank you.